Welcome to this week's Brown Bag seminar, the first one in 2021. I'm very glad to welcome Andrew Vidali, who is currently a junior visiting fellow in the field of excellence, dimensions of Europeanization at the University of Graz. Andrew is otherwise a PhD student in early modern history at the University of Trieste and a senior teaching assistant at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, focusing also on early modern history. He takes us not to Southeastern Europe, but to early modern Renaissance Italy. And he's looking at justice at the borders, extradition agreements and border banditry in Renaissance Italy. And as part of our this year's focus on the question of border making and crossing borders. So Andrew, without further ado, I would give you the floor for your presentation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Florian, for the for the introduction. I also would like to thank the Field of Excellence Dimension of Europeanization for giving me the opportunity to develop my postdoctoral project, which investigates the relationship between crime and extradition treaties. So the first thing that might come to your mind when talking about extradition is this person. I believe you recognize him. And in this picture, he seems to be quite happy. And we cannot really blame him. A couple of weeks ago, you may remember that the request to extradite Julian Assange, co-founder of WikiLeaks, from the UK to the United States was rejected. Now it's not really necessary to discuss the legal case, which involves Sweden, which accused him of rape, England, where he is still in a maximum security prison, and the United States, which wants to prosecute him for various crimes, including espionage, which is punishable by death. What should be really stressed about this long and complicated legal affair is the role that political pressure plays in a game that should only be conducted according to the rules of international law. Julian Assange's story showed how justice, which in liberal democracy we believe should be impartial, can still be influenced by political will. And this distortion, if we want to call it that way, is even more pronounced when extradition comes into play. So as you can easily guess, extradition is part of international law, and for this reason is regulated by agreements negotiated by states wishing to prosecute specific crimes. So how does this legal institution relate to the process of European formation and integration? Well, the progress of EU extradition legislation is a complex process marked by, first of all, the transition from bilateral to multilateral agreements. It is a legal development that has advanced in parallel with other forms of European integration. The starting point was extradition. The agreement reached had some weak points. There was no prospect of harmonizing national criminal laws or drawing up an international criminal code. The intensification of European integration made very soon these instruments and the rule established, which left a great deal of autonomy to individual states, unsuitable. So with the adoption of the Schengen Agreement and the gradual abolition of internal borders, new necessities emerged. The free movement of European citizens had to be reconciled with the introduction of new forms of judicial and investigative cooperation, as to create a European judicial area. So during the 1990s, the regulation of extradition between EU member states constantly strengthened. And the turning point is maybe the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty of the European Union, which led to stronger cooperation between national police forces, but also to the birth of Europol and Eurojust. Finally, in the early 21st century, the European arrest warrant replaced the internal extradition system. And the most significant aspect of this innovation is that judicial authorities alone can take decisions without any kind of political consideration. So as a dimension of Europeanization visiting fellow, I aim at investigating the historical roots of the process of European judicial integration that took place between the late 20th and early 21st century. In particular, I also aim at examining how extradition worked in the centuries before the birth of international law, which is conventionally identified in the Peace of Westphalia in the mid-17th century. So according to historians and legal historians, modern extradition agreements were born in the 18th century as a consequence of the formalization of international law, so also thanks to the Peace of Westphalia. But before that turning point, some forms of cooperation between states based on extradition already existed. If today European supranational judicial bodies prosecute organized crime, international terrorism, cybercrime, illegal trafficking in human body, fraud, and economics crime, one of the biggest problems in late medieval and early modern Europe was banditry. So I think I should spend a few words to describe banditry in pre-modern Europe. In particular, this is the book that shaped our image of our understanding of outlaws. The book Bandits, published in 1969, which focuses on the concept of outlaws within the mythology, folklore, and literature of Europe. The author, Eric J. Hobsbawm, investigates this issue in relation to the classical Marxist concepts of class struggle. That is because in this book, Hobsbawm investigates the history of banditry and organized crime and its relationship to class structures in agrarian societies. Hobsbawm indicates a specific form of crime that fits into the category that he invented of social bandit. Social bandits were made of young men, landless peasants, free men, military deserters. According to Hobsbawm, social bandits are distinguished from other kinds of organized crime, as they were perceived as rebels who opposed to the unjust system of feudalism. And it's in this very opposition to feudalism that Hobsbawm identifies the seeds of class struggle. But today, we know that the image presented by Hobsbawm does not really match what archival sources tell us about outlaws and the issue of banditry. First of all, in late medieval and early modern Europe, there is not necessarily an equation between bandits, between outlaws, so those who were cast out of society, and those who engage in banditry. If by banditry we mean a kind of organized crime, typically involving the threat or use of violence. Today we think of banditry as a crime itself, committed from the very moment that an armed band is organized, even if this band has not committed a single attack yet. And that is because the very establishment of an armed band constitutes a great danger, a great threat to society. In late medieval and early modern Europe, this overlapping between someone who has been outlawed, the constitution of an armed band to commit extortion, robbery, and murder did not exist. This is a process that this overlapping develops in Europe from the 16th and early 17th century onwards, but not homogeneously in all of Europe. Banishment was actually a punishment that tribunals could inflict also to those who had not committed any kind of violence at all. For instance, one could be outlawed for not paying debts. Conversely, it was possible to commit crimes related to banditry, such as murder, without being outlawed, but just having to pay a fine to the court. Noble bandits were actually commonplace in pre-modern Europe, and when they engaged in banditry, they represented a problem that courts and rulers had to handle much more carefully than those involving lower classes, which could instead be repressed without much trouble. So before the figure of bandits, of outlaws, and the crime of banditry overlap, outlaws were those who had only been banned, those who had been exiled by the community and stripped of any legal guarantee. This meant that outlaws, especially those convicted of capital crimes, could be killed with impunity by anyone if they returned to the territories forbidden to them. So banishment was a legal tool used by late medieval and early modern courts to regulate the conflicts that marked pre-modern society. conflicts that express themselves through feuding and factional struggle. So outlaws were actually a byproduct of this form of conflicts. But being outlawed did not mean that it was no longer possible to re-enter legality, to re-enter society. It was possible to get out of this condition, of this legal status. These usually involved negotiating with the authorities, so with courts and rulers, and settling the conflicts that had triggered violence. And one way to prove it was showing that peace with the opponents had been achieved. So what is in all of this the role of extradition agreement, just like the one negotiated between Mantua and Venice in the mid 16th century, the one that you're looking at? Well, this is actually a copy that was published in the Venetian territories in 1661. So extradition treaties come into play because there were some heinous crimes that states wanted to prosecute in any case. These included premeditated murder, arson, assassination, highway robbery. But this list later included further crimes such as forgery, use of prohibited firearms, rape, and other more. But what extradition agreements targeted were not crimes per se, rather than the criminals who exploited political borders to find shelter from justice. When someone crossed the border, local authorities had no longer any power over them, because by entering a different jurisdiction, one was automatically granted sanctuary, asylum. So the driving force behind the development of extradition agreements is the exploitation of the immunity granted by borders to repeatedly commit new crimes. There is another element that shows that extradition agreements were more concerned with criminals rather than with crimes. There are examples of people who committed a crime and then fled to another state and never returned, so without committing new crimes. So extradition agreements are generally not designed to catch such individuals who lead a peaceful life in another state. In fact, extradition treaties very often included articles stating that only outlaws who lurk near the borders, taking advantage of the impunity that came with it, should be captured and handed over. These clauses are most frequently found in the agreements negotiated by very large states, such as the Republic of Venice. But what is the reason they make North, Central, and Northern and Central Italy, the context that I investigate, a place where there is a strong development of extradition agreements? Well, the answer is quite simple. Political fragmentation. The greater the number of borders, the greater the chances for outlaws to find shelter, to find sanctuary. So in Renaissance Italy, there were some very large states, such as the Republic of Venice and the Dukedom of Milan. There were also many medium-sized states, such as those of Mantua and Modena Ferrara, that we are going to look at more closely. And finally, there were many small lordships and republics. But what are the features that mark the development of extradition agreements in central and northern Italy? So the first thing is their emancipation. Extradition agreements initially were at first individual chapters included in peace and alliance treaties, but then they became independently negotiated agreements. So I connect this process of legal emancipation to the growth of the problem of banditry over the Renaissance period, but also to the formation of the so-called regional states in central and northern Italy. Second, the gradual extension of the crimes included in extradition agreement, which is something that I already recall. But this process developed in different ways. There were political actors who slowly broadened the range of crimes prosecuted throughout the century, as in the case of the Republic of Venice. But there are also political actors such as Mantua and Milan, which from the very first extradition included an extensive series of crimes, of offenses, and these lists are repeated over the centuries in the new treaties. But eventually, even these states added further crimes in the later year of the Renaissance period. Third, there is what I would call a process of formalization and almost bureaucratization of extradition agreements. At first, in the late Middle Ages, extradition agreements specified that bandits would only be handed over at the simpler request of princes and ambassador. And by a simple request, they meant oral or written requests. But then, during the 16th and 17th century, new mechanism complicated the delivery of outlaws. For instance, new treaties established the requirement for supporting documentation, for instance, the conviction sentence, but they also regulated the action of officers at the border when delivering bandits. And they also determined how costs should be paid. Fourth and final, the relationship between legal developments and the circulation of models between states. The innovation, the transformation introduced in extradition agreements spread and were incorporated into the new treaties negotiated by other states. So there is what I would say is a trend toward homogenization and uniformity. And I think that the political weight of the various states also played a role in this. The most important political and the most important and powerful states, such as the Republic of Venice and the Dukedom of Milan, for instance, had a stronger political weight than smaller and less powerful states. And this meant that the first were easily able to impose their terms on the latter. So now I would like to end this presentation by focusing on a case study. That of the borders between the Dukedom of Modena-Ferrara, which is the one that you're looking at, and those of Mantua in the 16th century. So if we take a look from the border perspective, this is the border area between the two dukedoms of Modena-Ferrara and Mantua that we are now going to take a closer look at. Now, I use Google Earth to mark on a map the places that are mentioned in extradition requests between Mantua and Modena-Ferrara, with the purpose to understand which were the sites, which were the places on the borders, but also in the hinterland, that were the actual protagonists of the action of outlaws, and also the protagonists of the reaction by rulers and officers in charge of public order. So I have, as you can see, I have marked in yellow the places belonging to the Dukedom of Modena-Ferrara, and in red those belonging to the Mantua state. But you can also see some white dots. Those are separate jurisdiction. Those are small states independent from both Mantua and Modena-Ferrara. So all the white dots on the western part, so Sabbioneta, Guastalla, Luzzara, Novellara, sorry, and Bagnolo in Piano, were small city-states, were small lordships under the rule of the smaller branches of the Gonzaga family, the very same family that ruled over Mantua. But even though they belonged to the same family, the small states were independent from the Gonzaga family ruling in Mantua. What does this mean? Well, that means that the extradition agreement negotiated between Mantua and Modena-Ferrara did not really apply to these other small states even though they still belonged to the Gonzaga family. Then in the center of the map, you can see the towns of Mirandola and Concordia. They were another independent lordship under the Pico family rule. Now I say that we should take a closer look at this map, which I divided into three areas: the western, the central, and the eastern border area. So this is the western border area. Here I rotated the view in order to put the river Po, which is this one, at the center of the map, in order to show how it actually divides the Mantua and Modena-Ferrara dominions. And the towns of Brescello and Viadana are the most important ones in this area, as they were the most mentioned one in the requests for capturing or delivering bandits. And as a consequence, these governors, the governors of Brescello and Viadana, were the one most involved in hunting down bandits or in their delivery across the border. This is the central border area. Here you can see how small independent states were an element that increased political fragmentation even more, and as a consequence, created even more spaces of immunity for outlaws. In fact, we could have expected many more places mentioned in this area. However, this is not the case exactly because of the Mirandola lordship. And we can see that very clearly in this map that I already showed. This is the map of the Mantua Dominion. You can see that the Mirandola lordship is the one which actually borders in the central border area with Mantua. So there's no direct border between Mantua and Modena Ferrara in this area. And finally, the eastern border. As you can see, there is quite a number of locations highlighted, which means that in this area, the activities of outlaws were much more intense. The Mantuan towns of Ostiglia and Sermide were the most involved in the fight against border banditry, while the governor of Bondeno was the one most engaged from the other side, from the Ferrarese Modenese side. So now let's take again a look at the map from a broader perspective. You may have noticed one thing in the western part. So in this area, the geographical and political elements overlap in the River Po, which divides the two dominions and the most important town, those of Brescello and Viadana. The right side of the Po River is under Mantua rule, and the left side is under Ferrarese Modenese rule. But this is not the case in the central border area. So this one, where the Po River loses this function of border elements, and there is instead further fragmentation due to the presence of small independent states. Above all, there are Mantuan dominions beyond the River Po, because this is where the Gonzaga family actually came from. It came from the city of Gonzaga. And even though the Gonzaga family was able in the 14th century to rule over Mantua, it was also able to preserve their ancestral dominions beyond the River Po. And finally, the eastern border area. Here, the River's Po becomes again a border element, but not in the same way as it is in the western border area. So as you can see, the right bank of the River Po is under Mantua rule as far as the town of Revere, and then it falls under Ferrarese rule at the town of Melara. On the left side of the left bank of the River Po is under Mantua rule as far as the town of Felonica. And this is also the area where the eastern and the central border area rejoins. So now I would conclude my presentation by saying that, as I tried to show from these maps and from the previous presentation, borders in pre-modern Europe were permeable, were porous areas, and geographical elements such as mountains and rivers were not always boundary elements, were not always defining elements. Outlaws were, while rulers would try to reconcile the nature of borders with the need to not compromise their sovereignty, but at the same time ensuring the security of the communities living near the borders. So the result of this complex and difficult compromise can be seen in extradition agreements negotiated between states and in their implementation, in their enforcement. So thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much for your presentation. And so I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. And if you would just end your screen presentation, I think that would be good. Then we can see all of us better. So the floor is open. So you just have to click on stop share screen, Andrew, and then we can continue.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So, I mean, my question would be, first of all, I mean, again, maybe just to break the ice, is more about, you know, borders in early modern Europe, because again, I think you're making this point that borders are permeable, and even if we look at these old maps, which of course suggest these lines of borders between rulers but I think it is probably how can we imagine these borders? Because I think my understanding as a contemporary historian is much more that these early modern borders were never as fixed in the sense that there was, of course, no border guard there. There wasn't this kind of what we imagine a border to look like today. It looked very different. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more. How did a border look like? And can we even think, is even a line, as often historical maps present, the most appropriate representation, or is it more of a zone or an overlapping area to conceptualize borders?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Well, the answer is actually the second option you presented. So there is no a straight line as we could as border are in the contemporary age as borders are now. Historians describe borders, as you said, as zonal area. So area where borders of different states overlap. And this is also reflected in the extradition agreements, because some chapters of the extradition agreement said that outlaws could be followed by official even into the other state's border as far as 15 kilometers after the borders. And that is because there was no clear distinction between state borders. So yes, borders in pre-modern Europe are certainly can be defined as zonal area rather than fixed borders like we know in today Europe and in the world. Well, obviously, where there was a defined geographical element, such as a river, things were obviously easier. But that was not always the case, as I try to show in what I call the central border area between Mantua and Modena Ferrara. So thank you very much for your question.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andrew. I'd like to open the floor for other questions. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question at this particular point? Again, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and I'm happy to give you the word. Alternatively, you can also ask a question in the chat option. Dilkik, you have raised your hand, so you could just turn on your mic and your camera and the floor is yours. Dilkik do you want to?
Hello.
Hi.
You see me? Hi.
Yes.
Hi. Hello. Thank you, Andrew. It was very nice, very interesting presentation. Yeah, my question goes because in the Ottoman context, also we have similar phenomena. Actually, the problems of banditry was the same issue. And it was very common in Ottoman borders and especially Ottoman mountainous areas. And of course, in many other places in Europe. But from Ottoman perspective, I can say that we have this phenomenon that Ottomans were negotiating with bandits. And actually in many cases, they were offering them to guard borders or to become a rural police of the area that they were practicing banditry. And so in these cases, in many famous bandits, they became Ottoman officials. And we have this case of Ali Pasha of Yanina, which is very famous and well known. So I want to ask if in your case, the Italian authorities or Venetian authorities, they were pursuing also bandits, that they can negotiate with them and they can, use them as a force or to suppress banditry. Yeah, this is what I want to ask actually, if you have the similar issue in your case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dilek, for your question. Well, the answer is yes. There are instances of authorities, of rulers trying to exploit outlaws, and outlaws at the same conversely, outlaws exploiting rulers and authorities. By that I mean that well, first of all, in time of war, outlaws could negotiate their way out of this legal status by enrolling in the army and gaining a pardon at the end of the war. But more commonly, outlaws could easily become bounty hunters, and that is because there were some laws which are actually very widespread in all of Europe, which says that a bandit who captures or even kills another outlaw can set himself free. So it was very easily for a bandit to set himself free by capturing or killing another outlaw. And authorities try to exploit this legislation by urging outlaws to set themselves free in this way. This also had some negative impact because some historians says that this phenomenon actually increased violence. So well, the answer to your question is yes. There is always a negotiation between outlaws and authorities, also in Italy, and this negotiation, even outlaws had all the advantages in engaging in this form of negotiation, not only authorities. I see that there's another question.
Yes, there's one by Leif Scheuermann. I don't know if Leif, you would like to ask the question in person.
Yes, I can do. The
Yes.
only problem could be that my connection is not that stable, therefore I did write it.
Okay, but we hear you now, so that's perfect. So why don't you go ahead and tell us the question?
Okay. It was, I saw lots of your wonderful maps, and I saw you used Google Maps for all of this, and the old maps. And I really asked myself, wouldn't this be an ideal topic for GIS or geoinformation system, and in special geoanalysis of the spaces? So making buffers or looking at the distances to the borders and so on would be a perfect perfect topic for geoinformation systems. Why did you use Google Maps?
Yeah, thank you very much. I used Google Earth because it was the simplest software that I could use to very quickly build up the maps that I show you. I also use OKMap, which is another software to design other maps that I didn't show you because they were repeated the things that I already highlighted in the maps that I made with Google Earth. But the answer to your question is yes, I would. I'm very interested in using GIS software, and it's something that I want to do. For this presentation, I drew up a map in the quickest way possible, and that was by using Google Earth instead that GIS software like ArcGIS. Yes, that is definitely something that I want to do. I'm going to do in the next future. So I also think that would be very useful, not only to highlight the places, but also to highlight the networks. Because as I said, there are some towns on the border which are more important than others because those governors were the one most involved in the fight against border banditry. So I think I could also use GIS software to highlight the networks that from the most important towns where the governors from show the network between the most important governors and the other places along the border or in the hinterland where outlaws carried out their crimes. So thank you
If
for
you
your
have any
question.
problems, just feel free to contact me.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks also for the offer. Any other questions from the audience at this particular point in time? Otherwise, I have a few more, of course, because lots of food for thought. So I'll just throw this out while we're waiting. Andrew, to which degree is this phenomena, which you've given us the example of this border area between between Ferrara, Mantua, right? And but to which degree can you tell is this a broader phenomena? At least in the North Italian region of this extradition and the handling of the borders, because you've also mentioned the agreement between Mantua and Venice, I believe. So how much is this, is what you told us from your sense representative or is it exceptional in a certain way?
I would say that the cases, the cases that are brought is very is not exceptional at all. It actually represents quite what actually happened in other states of northern and central Italy, the Renaissance period. I focused on Mantua and Modena because in the documents that I look at between the diplomatic correspondences between Mantua and Modena, between Mantua, Modena, and Ferrara, the places along the borders are much more mentioned rather than in the correspondences between Modena and Venice, for instance, or Modena and Milan, or Modena and other city-states. I think that's the only exception in this case, but otherwise, the problem of border banditry was very widespread in all of Italy, but it was also very widespread in all of Europe, at least until the early 18th century. And there are many studies. And there are many studies that shows this problem and how states dealt with it. But unfortunately, there are not many studies on extradition agreements before modern extradition agreements. So not many studies on extradition agreements before the 18th century, or at least obviously I tried to gather as many as secondary literature as possible, but I was not able to find sufficient data.
Thank you. We have Fabio who's put a question. So maybe Fabio, do you want to ask it in person? That would be actually great. If you just turn on your camera and microphone.
I can try.
Yes, perfect. We see you very well. Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to expand on Professor Spieber's question and ask if you are aware of how the Kingdom of Naples was working with its neighbors, maybe especially the Papal State as regarded extradition, because it was a bit more consolidated than other states.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your questions. You're right. The Naples state, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Papal States are, we could say, more consolidated states, much broader states than their counterparts in central and northern Italy. I know that there are some extradition agreements negotiated between Naples and Rome in the second part of the 16th century onward. I haven't studied them. But yeah, I can tell you that there are some extradition agreements negotiated, because banditry was also a problem. Border banditry was also a problem in that area, in the bordering area between Rome and Naples. So I don't know if you're going to study maybe that problem. I can tell you that you're going to find evidences of problems caused by border boundaries, but you're also going to find extradition treaties negotiated between them, between the Kingdom of Naples and the Papal States. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question. Any other questions?
Sorry,
Yes,
building up on the previous question. Obviously, in northern central Italy, since there were so many small independent states, as I said, there were so many more borders, and which increased the chances for outlaws to find shelter and sanctuary. And this in turn increased the number of extradition agreements negotiated by the very same states.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's, I mean, what you're suggesting is basically, I mean, and I think this is what, I mean, historians have been arguing, I think, for a while, especially of early modern history, as far as I can tell, is that this often kind of arbitrary decision of taking 1648 and the end of the 30 Years' War as the beginning of the modern state might have to be revised. I mean, this kind of concept has been taken, of course, by not just historians, but by political scientists to talk about the rise of the modern state, and that maybe that is a process which precedes 1648 in many cases, and I think what you're suggesting, and I mean, I don't know if this is one important takeaway, but this is how I would see it from what I've heard, is that the beginnings of the modern state precede the 30 Years' War, definitely in some parts of Europe, especially in maybe northern Italy, and that they've concluded international law kind of arrangement which are not that different from ones which emerge afterwards. And so we have to maybe rethink about this very rigid divider which we mentally often use when talking about pre-modern and modern states.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. For this research, I haven't yet studied what happens after the mid 17th century. So I haven't seen how what is conventionally seen as the birth of international law, I haven't seen how this impacted on this kind of diplomatic negotiation between states. But yeah, I am confident enough to say that there is certainly a lot of continuity between the period before and after the Peace of Westphalia, at least in this topic, in this issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think that changes comes into play well after, I would say, from the 18th century onward. I'm basically referring to Karl Harter studies, he says that from the 18th century, he identifies new security regimes which targeted international political crimes, thanks to new forms of extradition agreements. So I think that he's right to say that the 18th century is a turning point. So I would say that before that there is much more continuity than disruption. Then the difference is the continuity are much more important than the differences. So yeah, the Peace of Westphalia is just a convention made up by historians to say that's when international law was born.
Great, thank you. If there are no further questions, and this would be the last chance I would give to everybody, then I think we can conclude our today's session. Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing your research with us. I think even if we're not, maybe many of us are not working in this particular area, I think it's been very inspiring and also thought-provoking. And I would also like to invite all of the participants to join us in the next Brown Bag seminar, which will be the 26th of January, so in 2 weeks' time. Zuzana Vujevic, who is also a visiting fellow, will be presenting her work on a transnational fellowship of Southeast European women intellectuals in the interwar period. So we're moving time-wise a few centuries ahead and looking at the role of women in discussing Balkan cooperation during that period. So Andrew, thank you very much. And thanks to all of the participants for joining us for the Braunbeck seminar today.
Thank you very much for your attention and the questions.